My name is Dr. Jim Morehead. I have a practice in Lexington, Kentucky. It's all ambulatory. There's 9 veterinarians. It's certainly mostly in that neck of the woods, mostly thoroughbred racehorses or broodmare farms. We do a lot of sales work. We do a fair number of horse shows, and we've got an ever-increasing number of competition horses outside of the thoroughbred realm. When I got asked to do this, I thought, well, this is a little bit of, this is odd that 5 years after talking about the NAIS that we would jump back into this, but you know, sometimes you think some things have passed. But I, probably 7 years ago, David Foley, the executive director of the AAP, called me one day and says, "Jim, what do you know about equine ID and traceability?" I said, "Nothing." He said, "Okay, that's good." So I got put on what was called the Equine Species Working Group, which some people have alluded to this morning already, and it was the USDA had proposed a national animal ID system. And through the American Horse Council, with representatives of all the different organizations that belong to the American Horse Council, we formed the Equine Species Working Group to try to work with USDA and horse owners, be the liaison between the groups, to try to come up with a system that was reasonable, not excessive, could actually trace horses, wasn't cumbersome. So that's lots of restrictions being put on there. What quickly became apparent was everybody doesn't see the world the same way as veterinarians do. And I know that's hard to believe, but even amongst the different groups, American Horse Council, you know, the racing people see the world one way, the trail horse people do not see it the same way. And so with each street that we went down trying to develop some methodology for USDA, there was somebody that was standing in the way of what was perceived as progress by the general group. So what I would say to this group is, just because you run into a roadblock doesn't mean that the system, that there can't be a system that's functional, that functions to do to deliver traceability to the equine world. Even with the last speaker, you know, with each of the different silos that she was talking about, and then you've got the veterinary silo, and you know, in our veterinary silo, we've got lots of client confidential records, and so I can see the veterinary community, if Tom Lenz diagnoses palmar heel pain on a 2-year-old quarter horse in Kansas City, and that goes with that horse, because that's kind of a vague term as it is, and maybe that horse just gets over it, or maybe just a new shoeing job fixes it, but that record goes with that horse. And so that doesn't mean we can't have a functional system to identify horses and trace them in disease outbreaks, but you've got to be careful with how much information you throw in there, because the general public believes that we want to gather up all their information and put it in a place that the government has access to. And I know that sounds odd to you, but people have a paranoia in this world that is hard to describe until you start talking about sticking a microchip in their horse and monitoring their movements. We came up with this movement was talked about, previous speaker, which there's going to be lots of overlap, I'm certain. Movement's unique to horses. Yeah, we move cows and we move pigs and we move sheep and goats and everything else, but they don't move like horses do. And so we came up with reasonable things, a voluntary system of horse identification with microchips. Just sure what we came up with. Realizing there's other forms of identification. For years we've used brands and lip tattoos and markings, whorls, cowlicks, and gosh, we've been getting along all right. And that's certainly the argument you're going to run up against. But we came up with, our group came up with voluntary horse identification, voluntary premise identification, and movement if they were going across state lines. And if you got a Coggins, or if you needed a health paper to go interstate, then you needed to have positive identification. And it seems reasonable. Seemed reasonable to all of us. Our recommendation was the ISO compliant 11784, 785 chip that was 15 character country code chip that was talked about. And so we thought we were, after 3 years of lots of meetings, we thought we were on the right path. But this thing called black helicopters came up, kept coming up, and people thought that if you stick a microchip into a horse, that there's going to be a GPS coordinate, and the government can follow it. And no matter how many times we told them, remember this program was a USDA program, and Neil Hammerschmidt is here, who's certainly behind it, but involved in it. I shouldn't say behind it. That sounds bad. I apologize, Neil. He was the liaison from USDA that was trying to help us work through it. But this, the paranoia of the general public and horse-owning public was kept coming up, and the government access to private information. And I'm not talking about just medical records, but ownership, where the horse goes. Does this horse go on trail rides in Arkansas, or does it cross state lines? Just things that people, a guy like me thought, well, this is just craziness. They don't really understand. I put this MRLS thing in here because in 2001 in Lexington, Kentucky, we had a thing called mare reproductive loss syndrome, and even though it wasn't an infectious disease, turns out, it was just had something to do with caterpillars. On Tuesday before the Kentucky Derby was when we kind of all started recognizing it. By Thursday, we were really recognizing, because we had lots of mares turning up that were not pregnant, that used to be pregnant. And then on Saturday, they had something called the Kentucky Derby, and all the owners gathered over there, and they all got to talking, which was what caused the next thing. On Sunday, you couldn't believe the number of owners that showed up with their own horse trailers. They didn't have a Coggins, but they didn't need one. They didn't have a health paper, and they didn't want us to know where they were going. And so I think that's something everybody always has to remember. I think you can put microchips in things, and you can say we're going to monitor movement and we're going to label premises, but horse owners will show up at 8 o'clock at night and load up their horse to protect them and get them out of there. And we saw, just with the herpes situation currently at the fairgrounds, things happen, and it may take regulatory officials a little while to shut a place down. And in that interim period, there's lots of talk, and so people get mobile. Katie, when she asked me to come talk, she gave me some guidelines, and she said, it's interesting the AAP doesn't have a position statement on microchips. Well, gosh, the AAP is a reasonable bunch of guys and girls, and we realize that you can identify a horse in a lot of different ways other than just a microchip. Now, certainly we're all team players too, and if the industry comes forward and wants to use microchips, such as the way the Jockey Club has done this year, we've put in a voluntary system with the Jockey Club this year in our practice. We've probably put microchips in 70% of the foal crop, and it's not mandatory this year. It's mandatory next year. But it was not government motivated, government stimulated. It's just the Jockey Club. And it's been, I'll be interested to hear what Matt says about it, but in our practice, it's certainly been well received. The AAP realizes the benefits of permanent animal identification. That's, it makes all the sense in the world. And some standardized form that can be kept track of, it certainly makes sense too. As I've said before, you know, there's microchips and all the microchip companies, but there's iris scans and there's photos and there's descriptions and new technologies, and I forgot, there's brands. And so you have to remember, we've been identifying horses a long time, and it's, I'm a proponent of microchips, but I realize that next year there might be something better, and so we all need to keep an open mind and think long and hard about it. The Paint Horse Association is doing, which is Billy Smith, who is also a co-chair with the Equine Species Working Group, and he's now with the Paint Horse Association. They're doing iris scans. The AVMA came out recently with a position on animal identification, including wording on microchips, and just this last week, we all AVMA members get a e-newsletter, and just this last week it was talking about equine organizations increasingly wanting animals microchipped. And down at the bottom there it says microchip placement handled by veterinarians is simple, relatively painless, inexpensive, writes veterinarian Nancy Leveling in the Horse Magazine. Not everybody thinks that a microchip needs to be applied by a veterinarian. Certainly that was our recommendation from the Equine Species Working Group, and that's what we've done in our practice. But horse people are an independent sort. There's a news brief. They've been doing it for a long time, and to think anybody's going to tell them how to do it, you got to get a little buy-in. And the Jockey Club, I have to say, has been pretty coy in this, in that they came up with it, they've introduced it, they've said this is what we're going to do, and they're getting buy-in. What's the future hold? Well, it kind of depends. Money, you know, the National Animal ID System, the General Accounting Office reviewed it and said it would cost $200 to $300 million a year just to maintain it. That's a lot. Is it something we can do on our own without as much government involvement? Sure. Who's going to maintain the database is a huge deal. Nobody trusts anybody with information. So the more information you put into it, the less trust is involved. So keep it to a minimum. I could argue it's maybe better to have 9 silos. And in a case of an emergency, there's communication between them. But it's a point you can discuss. Movements, which one to do and which ones not to do. You know, like I said, we said interstate, but Texas is a big state. And so you can move a long way in the state of Texas and not cross state lines. And public concerns over privacy.